Have you ever wondered what label archaeologists and historians 1,000 years from now, or 10,000 years, or 100,000 if humans survive that long, will use to describe our time in history? In particular, how might they try and characterize our era, a period that began around 250 years ago with the beginning of industrialization, in terms of the material that dominates our technology? Will they label this the steel age, or the concrete age, or the plastic age, or even the silicon age, given the critical role of that element in our digital technology? It really is fascinating to think about the labels future historians will apply to us, just as we have applied terms like the Iron Age and the Bronze Age to earlier periods of history. In this lecture, we are focused on the Stone Age, more specifically the Paleolithic era, or Old Stone Age, which lasted from roughly 200,000 to 11,000 years ago. The Paleolithic was a period of human history in which technologies were dominated by stone tools, although wood was, of course, also hugely important for creating spear shafts, arrows, and handles for our stone axes and other implements. The term Paleolithic was actually coined by British archaeologist John Lubbock in 1865. It comes from two Greek words, palaios for old and lithos for stone. Now, Lubbock was a real Renaissance man, a successful banker, philanthropist, politician, scientist, and archaeologist. Two of his books on archaeology became standard reference works in the field for decades: Prehistoric Times and The Origin of Civilization. Prehistoric Times, or to give it its full title, Prehistoric Times as Illustrated by Ancient Remains and the Manners and Customs of Modern Savages, was arguably the most influential archaeology book of the 19th century. It was in this book that Lubbock introduced the term Paleolithic and also Neolithic, or New Stone Age, for the era that followed. Despite Lubbock's influence, the Paleolithic era of human history is not one that figures prominently in most history courses today. But an understanding of the Paleolithic is crucial in explaining all the periods of history that follow. It was during the Paleolithic that humans first demonstrated those remarkable abilities and characteristics that make us who we are. Not only is the Paleolithic era the foundation of human history, you may be surprised to know that it represents 96% of all the time our species has been on the planet. And here's a truly humbling fact: we don't know the name of a single human who lived during that vast expanse of time. It was during the Paleolithic era that humans left Africa and peopled the Earth, despite the ravages of the Ice Age, which remarkably corresponds with these great global migrations. The last Ice Age began about 110,000 years ago. By 90,000 before present, or BP, humans had left Africa and were settling in Southwest Asia. By 50,000 BP, we were living in Australia. By 35,000 years ago, in the face of bitterly cold conditions, humans were living in Siberia. And by at least 15,000 years ago, we had migrated to the Americas. If measured in time then, the Paleolithic was clearly the most important period in human history. But there were far fewer humans around during the Paleolithic. So in terms of population, the agrarian and modern eras that followed are much more important. Demographers estimate that more than 100 billion humans have lived on Earth since our species emerged, and 20% of that total has lived in just the last 2 centuries. The agrarian era, which lasted from 11,000 to around 250 years ago, held about 68% of all humans who have ever lived, and the vast Paleolithic accounted for only 12%. These are precisely the sorts of themes that big history is particularly focused on revealing, by the way. Despite the criticism of some traditional historians that too many close-up details are lost in large-scale history, the fact is that many themes and thresholds can only be seen on the macro scale. And arguably, these themes are ultimately of much greater significance than many of the traditional details, because they help us make sense of the otherwise confusing morass of history. Two crucial large-scale themes stand out from the Paleolithic. The first is that humans began to apply their unique collective learning ability to cope with massive global climate changes. The second is that humans spread all around the world using new technologies they invented to adapt to a range of different environments, a development we call extensification. Let's look at climate change first. What did it really mean to live in an ice age? Actually, the idea that the Earth has been subject to regular cycles of cooling is a relatively recent one. In 1821, Swiss engineer Ignaz van Etz presented a scientific paper in which he argued that glaciers had once been much larger and active at long distances from their current locations. Determined to disprove this idea, another Swiss geologist, Louis Agassiz, conducted fieldwork in 1836, which ironically convinced him that van Etz was correct. It was Agassiz who went on to propose the theory of the Ice Age, pointing to all manner of evidence of its widespread and significant effects. By the early 20th century, geologists were able to accurately map the extent of Ice Age glaciation and also show there had been not one ice age, but many. Despite extensive investigation, geologists are still unsure of what causes ice ages and the complicated cycles of freezing and warming that occur within them. The best that we can say, frankly, is that ice ages are triggered by the dynamic interplay of several Goldilocks conditions. These include the levels of solar energy, the distance of the Earth from the Sun, the changing position of the continents driven by plate tectonics, the pattern of currents in the ocean, and just the right mix of gases in the atmosphere. Some geologists argue that the last ice age has not in fact ended and that we are simply in the midst of a warming cycle within the larger context of an ice age. Humans living in the Paleolithic had to deal with at least two periods of major cooling, which means our lifeways and belief systems evolved under ice age conditions. Around 200,000 years ago, when our species first emerged, the climate was relatively mild. But from 195,000 years ago, conditions began to deteriorate as the planet entered a long glacial stage that lasted until about 123,000 years ago. Then a second period of cooling began roughly 110,000 years ago, which lasted until the beginning of the most recent warming trend around 11,500 years ago. So between 123 and 110,000 years ago, Earth's temperatures were actually quite similar to those of today. But from around 110,000 years ago, evidence shows the onset of a long-term shift to considerably colder climates. Recent high-resolution Atlantic sediment analysis suggests that the onset may have happened over a period of only about 400 years. Forests fragmented and retreated, winters grew longer and colder, and great ice sheets began to spread across the landscape in high latitudes. Glaciers leave a lot of evidence of where they have been, of course, so we've got a pretty clear geographical picture of the extent of glaciation. Geologists now estimate that during the frigid period, glacial ice covered 30% of Earth's land area, including 10 million square kilometers of North America. The amount of glaciation in the northern hemisphere was double that of the southern hemisphere because the great southern oceans prevented the ice sheets from spreading too far from Antarctica. Even in those regions of the globe not directly affected by ice, the cold caused Earth's climate to become drier. Forests dried out to be replaced by dry grasslands that turned into widespread cold deserts by about 70,000 years ago. Temperatures warmed up again after 60,000 years ago, but then around 30,000 BP, Earth was once again plunged into the grip of an intense, dry cold that reached its most extreme temperatures between 21,000 and 17,000 years ago. Just imagine trying to survive in this harsh environment of cold deserts that stretched across those areas of the continents that were not actually under ice. Then, around 14,000 years ago, Earth experienced a rapid global warming and moistening. The ice sheets began to retreat and the forests to grow back. But there was a final sting in the tail. After a couple of thousand years of recovery, the planet was once again plunged into a new, though short-lived glacial event known as the Younger Dryas. This may have come on over a period as brief as 100 years before disappearing again even more quickly in just a few decades. Extraordinary. Finally, from 11,500 BP, Earth became warmer and wetter. The ice sheets gradually melted, although it took them 2,000 years to do so, and vegetation spread over much of Afro-Eurasia. Geologists call the period between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago the Holocene optimum, and it was in this period that many human communities made the transition to agriculture. So let's remember that it was during this long climate roller coaster of periods of intense cold, of temporary warming and plunging temperatures again, that humans migrated out of Africa and inhabited the rest of the world. Can you imagine any other species being able to do that? The second key development of the Paleolithic, extensification, allowed humans to spread across the planet using new techniques devised through collective learning. But there was no parallel increase in the size or the density of human communities. So there was a little increase in the complexity of human societies as a result of extensification. By settling in new environments, eventually human populations did begin to increase globally, but for millennia, the size and density of human communities did not increase. Imagine the sorts of technologies humans had to invent to live in all the new environments they migrated into during the Paleolithic. Technologies for desert environments like Australia, including the boomerang for hunting and sophisticated water finding skills. Technologies for densely forested regions in Africa, Southeast Asia and South America, including the bow and poison-tipped arrow, and stone tools for clearing these thick jungles. Seagoing technologies to facilitate sea crossings. The first Australian Aboriginals crossed several large straits of ocean from about 50,000 years ago. And although the migration of humans to the Americas is better known as a journey by land across the Bering Strait, some of the first Americans also made the trip by canoe around 15,000 years ago. And cold region technologies for coping with ice age conditions and living in the Arctic, including the controlled use of fire, improved hunting techniques, better tailoring of clothing to keep out the cold, and the Inuit people, of course, are a great example of this. Correlating the dates of human migration with the chronology of climate change not only offers stunning evidence of human adaptability, it also suggests possible explanations for these migrations. Recent DNA studies have suggested that a severe and long-lasting drought in Africa may have been a motivating factor. It forced humans to live in smaller and more isolated communities that were constantly threatened with extinction. So when the drought began to recede, the survivors joined forces and began to emigrate out of Africa. The actual route taken might have been facilitated by cold snaps that lowered sea levels and opened up land bridges, such as one across the southern straits of the Red Sea. The migrants then used collective learning to invent new technologies that allowed them to prosper in new lands, thus ensuring the survival of the entire species. So how did people live in the new environments they now inhabited? What do we know of Paleolithic lifeways? Based on the available archaeological evidence, all Paleolithic human communities, wherever they were located, employed the strategy of foraging to survive. Foraging involves the gathering of foodstuffs and other needed materials from the environment to survive. Large grazing animals do something very similar, but there is something quite special about human foraging, and that is the level of teamwork employed. Some other animals do hunt in packs, but remember that what makes humans different is the fact that as they hunt and gather, they do so armed not only with weapons and tools, but with the information accumulated over many generations by thousands or even millions of other humans through collective learning. This makes human foraging more precise, more varied, and more information dependent than that of other species, and thus more efficient and more creative. This difference also explains why, over time, the impact of our species on the biosphere and the planet has inexorably increased. Foragers need a large territory to support themselves, so foraging populations are inevitably small. Most foragers lived in small, family-sized groups numbering somewhere between 10 and 50 people. These communities would split into even smaller groups to complete specialized tasks, and occasionally several groups would come together for larger communal meetings, as I'll discuss in just a moment. Anthropologists estimate that most humans in the Paleolithic would have met less than 500 other humans in their entire lives, if you can imagine that. Living in small groups meant that this was very much a do-it-yourself lifestyle. There was no government, so every task had to be taken care of within the family. Justice, education, eating, ceremonies, everything. The group was your world. Justice was personal and communal, with all members of the group collectively responsible for trial and punishment. Anthropologists have observed this kind of behavior among the San Bushmen of the Kalahari in southern Africa. In his book, The Dobe Kung, anthropologist Richard Lee describes the following example of communal justice at work among the San. Twi had killed 3 other people when the community, in a rare move of unanimity, ambushed and fatally wounded him in full daylight. As he lay dying, all the men fired at him with poisoned arrows until, in the words of one informant, he looked like a porcupine. Then, after he was dead, all of the women, as well as the men, approached his body and stabbed him with spears, symbolically sharing the responsibility for his death. The practice of gift-giving also emerged during the Paleolithic era as a mechanism for holding groups together because it established a reciprocal relationship between members. Ceremonies were also a vital part of communal life. Contact with neighboring groups were made at regular meetings and rituals where gifts, information, and marriage partners were swapped. At these multi-group gatherings, foragers would play games, would carry out special ceremonies, dance and sing, and exchange ideas. But feeding this many people, even for a short period, was tricky. So these gatherings had to be held where and when there were sufficient resources to do so. Australian Aboriginals regularly held communal dance ceremonies known as corroborees, high up in the Australian Alps, travelling hundreds of miles to do so. They chose this location because of the availability of a food source abundant enough to support the large gathering, the bogong moth. The moths would migrate in from surrounding slopes and plains and rest in the hot summer months in cracks in the granite outcrops among the mountains. The Aboriginals would smoke the moths out of the cracks, then cook them into a nutritious paste. These practices took place over tens of thousands of years. The oldest archaeological remains of this come from Birigai, near the Namadgi National Park, a magnificent wilderness park that I've backpacked through on several occasions. Archaeologists discovered a rock shelter in the region that was in use more than 20,000 years ago. To modern eyes, such foraging strategies might appear primitive, but they required a great deal of ingenuity. In order to survive, Paleolithic humans invented sophisticated toolkits of hunting, fishing, digging, and carrying equipment. Plus, they acquired an immensely detailed knowledge of the environment and a wide range of skills to exploit it. Imagine if you and I were suddenly dropped into the harsh interior of Australia or the Kalahari Desert. Would we be able to survive? Yet San Bushmen and Australian Aboriginal peoples survived and still do survive for immense periods of time in these environments using simple bows and arrows or spears and throwing sticks, along with basic digging and carrying equipment. Living in cold climates required particularly specialized skills, such as building ice houses, hunting in Arctic waters in open canoes, and sophisticated sewing skills. The site at Metzerik, near Kiev in the Ukraine, provides striking evidence of human ingenuity when it came to surviving in cold climates. In 1965, a farmer digging in his cellar struck the lower jawbone of a mammoth, which excavation revealed to be part of a semi-permanent dwelling that had been constructed entirely out of mammoth bones. 36 huge curving tusks had been used as arch supports for the roof. Other bones had been knitted together to create a framework for the walls, and even the tent pegs used to tie down the mammoth skin tent were made of bone. The bones from perhaps 95 mammoths were used in the construction, which has been dated to roughly 20,000 BP. The interior of the dwelling was rich in amber ornaments, fossilized shells, a mammoth head drum that appears to have been beaten by bone drumsticks, and tiny slivers of mammoth bones used to make needles, presumably to stitch garments together. Metzgerich provides a tantalizing glimpse into the minds of Paleolithic humans, how they thought about the world and their place in it. I say tantalizing because the scarcity and ambiguous nature of evidence about Paleolithic lifeways means that anything we say about the belief systems is highly speculative. Studies of modern small-scale societies suggest that foragers probably thought of themselves as part of the natural world and believed that their spirits would return in the form of other animals or natural features of the landscape after they died. So the first religious ideas devised by our species were shamanistic, a world full of spirits of many different kinds that humans could interact with under certain conditions. But the spirits were specific and localized, tied to particular places, so there was no sense yet of a belief in universal divinities. Let me give you 3 examples that provide some insight into Paleolithic beliefs, although again, it is difficult to know exactly what these beliefs were. Some 15,000 rock art sites of the Sand Bushmen have been discovered in South Africa, the oldest dated to 70,000 BP. Sand art has powerful ritual significance associated with their shamanistic religious practices. The shamans, often in a drug-induced altered state of consciousness, would enter the spirit world by somehow activating a supernatural force in the animals of the region and would later depict these experiences in cave paintings. Not all sand art is supernatural or magical in character. Much of it depicts daily life and the skills needed to cope with survival in this harsh environment. Other evidence of Paleolithic lifeways is found in enigmatic Venus figurines, which start appearing widely in Eurasia from around 25,000 BP. These small clay figurines of heavily pregnant women are the oldest sculptures depicting the human image to have been discovered thus far. Are they evidence of the worship of a mother goddess who is associated with the fertility of the earth? Are they toys or female self-portraits? Or were they manufactured by men as almost pornographic objects to be touched and fondled? We just don't know. Finally, what should we make of the Dolní Věstonice settlement located in the modern Czech Republic? The people who lived there 26,000 years ago were specialized mammoth hunters who were part of a trade network that stretched to the Mediterranean. The many sculptures, pendants, necklaces, and headbands found at the site show us that these people decorated themselves and their environment. Also found were 2,300 small clay figurines in an oven in a special round building constructed partly of limestone. The location and circumstances suggest that these figures were deliberately destroyed as part of a ritual ceremony, that they were fired in such a way that they would explode when placed in the fire. Bird bone flutes, which were presumably played during the ceremony, were also found in the building. Also discovered at Dolní was a grave containing the skeletons of 3 people, 2 males and a female, who were buried more than 27,000 years ago. The 2 males in the group died in apparent good health, although not peacefully, because a thick wooden pole had been thrust through one hip of each man. The female had suffered a stroke that had left her crippled and her face partially deformed. This discovery corresponded to 2 small portraits in ivory that had been discovered also at Dolní in 1936, depicting a woman with a face that appeared to have been deformed because of a stroke. The portraits may have been carried around for some symbolic purpose, but their meaning and purpose remains incredibly difficult to interpret. Whatever their precise meaning, the Dolní artifacts clearly indicate that the lives of the site's inhabitants were richly symbolic and that their interpersonal relationships were complex. There is an ongoing debate among prehistorians concerning the standards of physical and mental health enjoyed by Paleolithic foragers. Until the 1960s, the modern conception of early humans was that these Stone Age cavemen lived lives that were nasty, brutish, and short. But fieldwork done among the San in the 1960s, who were at that time seen as a relatively pristine foraging people, caused anthropologists to revise this view substantially. A new conception emerged of foragers enjoying an almost idyllic lifeway with plenty of free time and for interests beyond food gathering and a diet that ensured good nutritional health. Studies of other isolated Stone Age societies, including Australian Aboriginals, New Guinea Highlanders, and the Yanomami of the Brazilian rainforest, strengthened this interpretation. In 1972, anthropologist Marshall Salins described the Paleolithic as, quote, the original affluent society, characterized by adequate and varied food supplies, by high levels of health and fitness because of a balanced diet and frequent exercise. Think of the modern paleo diet, for example. Of freedom from the sort of disease epidemics that would later decimate sedentary communities, and with ample leisure time. Since the 1980s, however, this view has been increasingly challenged. A new generation of anthropologists working in the Kalahari Desert has noted that the San often live on the verge of starvation and that they did not choose to continue pursuing this lifeway but had no other option. In addition, none of the so-called pristine societies studied by anthropologists had in fact been untouched by the modern world, so their activities can't necessarily be considered accurate examples of Paleolithic lifeways. So the jury is still out on the Paleolithic standard of living, but the debate does remind us of the challenge of determining what paleo life was really like. It also reminds us of the dangers of assuming either that the past was somehow better than the present, or that human history has been a story of continuing progress. Finally, let's consider another very contentious aspect of the Paleolithic era, the impact of humans on the environment. The traditional view is that Paleolithic communities lived in harmony with nature, but modern evidence suggests that they had a considerable environmental impact through two habits in particular: fire stick farming and the extermination of entire species by hunting them to extinction. For tens of thousands of years, Australian Aboriginals set fire to huge tracts of bushland, both to drive game out for hunting and to promote the growth of new vegetation for gathering and to attract game. Archaeologist Rhys Jones coined the term fire stick farming in 1969 to describe this practice, which had the long-term effect of turning scrubland into grassland and suppressing the growth of certain species. In many areas, the practice dramatically impacted natural ecosystems by altering the vegetation to maximize food productivity for Aboriginal communities. Fire stick farming was also practiced in parts of Eurasia, in New Zealand and North America, and has been implicated in the other significant impact of Paleolithic humans upon the environment, the extinction of large animal species. As early humans spread across the globe, they entered continents that had no experience of earlier hominin colonization, particularly Australia and the Americas. Since the 1960s, paleontologists have amassed considerable evidence of the dramatic impact of these migrations. To put it bluntly, humans demonstrated their adaptive abilities and technological prowess by unintentionally initiating a wave of extinctions amongst the megafaunal inhabitants of these continents, who had no previous experience with this new predator. Percentages demonstrate the extent of this impact. In the Americas, nearly 75% of all animals weighing more than 100 pounds disappeared after humans arrived. In Australia, the figure is 86.4%. The larger species were the most threatened because they moved and reproduced very slowly. The mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and giant elk disappeared in Eurasia. The prehistoric horse, elephant, giant armadillo, and sloth vanished in North America. And in Australia, dozens of large marsupial species disappeared soon after the arrival of humans. These extinctions were destined to have a dramatic impact on the course of human history, forcing some communities to abandon foraging and take up farming, and depriving others of incredibly useful animals like horses. During the long Paleolithic era then, the virtuosity and creativity of early humans demonstrated both their constructive and destructive sides. The artists and sculptors of Dolny were members of the same species that drove the mammoth and giant kangaroo to extinction, and may have forced their only surviving hominin relative, the Neanderthal, to its demise. The appearance of modern humans some 200,000 years ago marks a significant turning point in the history of our planet. During the Paleolithic, humans peopled the physical world, began to investigate the metaphysical, and seriously impacted the environment. But there was a limit on the sort of cultural evolution that early humans were capable of, and that was the climate. Only with the waning of the last ice age some 11,500 years ago did the climate become stable enough for humans to cross the next threshold of complexity and adopt agriculture as a new way of life.